The forest was a wall of black until the first spark caught. It climbed the dry pine, licked at the stacked logs, and suddenly, the night retreated. A bonfire roared to life in the center of the clearing, throwing long, dancing shadows against the ancient trees. The heat pushed back the damp chill of the woods, turning the air into a shimmering veil of orange and gold. From the darkness, they emerged. Figures stepped into the light, one by one, their silhouettes sharpening as they approached the warmth. The crackle of burning wood became the heartbeat of the clearing, a rhythmic popping sound that punctuated the silence. Sparks spiraled upward, drifting like embers toward the canopy, vanishing into the stars. The crowd grew, a dense circle of different lives converging on this single point of light. Boots crunched on dry needles. The air tasted of wood smoke and anticipation. Everyone stood poised, waiting for the signal, their faces illuminated by the rising glow of the fire. The low murmur of the crowd died down as the fire settled into a steady, intense glow. Benimaru stepped forward, his boots finding purchase on a rough wooden crate. He stood above the sea of faces, his presence commanding the clearing. He raised a hand, and the shifting shadows on his face stilled. He took a breath, his gaze sweeping across the gathered figures, from the edge of the woods to the center of the warmth. When he spoke, his voice was clear and resonant, cutting through the persistent roar of the flames. "To Rimuru!" he shouted. "May your future be as bright as this fire, and your marriage as strong as our bonds." He held the glass high. For a heartbeat, the clearing was silent, the only sound the snap of a stray ember. Then, the reaction hit. A wave of cheers erupted, shaking the branches above and sending a fresh flurry of sparks spiraling into the dark. Benimaru remained on the crate, a faint smile touching his lips. The echoes of the cheers faded into the steady, rhythmic crackle of the bonfire. As the initial intensity of the toast subsided, the focus of the clearing shifted toward the long wooden tables laden with food. Steam rose in thick, fragrant ribbons from platters of roasted meats and charred vegetables, swirling into the cool night air. Veldora stood near the edge of the feast, his gaze scanning the spread with the intensity of a predator spotting prey. His eyes locked onto a massive, glistening kielbasa, resting on a silver tray. He did not hesitate. With a sudden fluid motion, he lunged across the table. His hand closed around the sausage, and in one seamless, practiced gulp, it vanished. The sheer speed of the act left the air momentarily still. A few guests nearby blinked, their forks hovering mid-air, while others let out a collective, startled laugh. Veldora wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. He looked toward the fire, his voice booming with a mix of triumph and humor. Indeed, the laughter sparked by Veldora's display lingered, weaving through the clearing like smoke. Guests moved between the tables, the clink of metal against wood punctuating the low hum of conversation. Deadpool navigated the crowd with a loose, rhythmic stride, his movements sharp and unpredictable. He paused near the edge of the firelight, his posture relaxed, a small, thin cylinder held between his fingers. He exhaled a plume of gray smoke that caught the light before dissipating into the dark. His gaze darted across the gathering, scanning the faces of the diverse assembly with a restless, searching intensity. He stopped abruptly, tilting his head as he focused on a figure sitting slightly apart from the main group. Speaking of unique, who brought the orange tomcat person? Are we sure he is not just a very fluffy, very judgmental cat? The air in the immediate vicinity of the fire seemed to thin, pulling the focus of every nearby guest toward the figure in question. Deadpool stood with his head cocked, waiting for a retort, but the clearing remained strangely hushed. The orange tomcat person did not jump. He did not growl. Instead, he slowly rotated his head, the movement fluid and precise, until his gaze settled squarely on the man in the mask. The firelight danced in the amber depths of his eyes, reflecting a calm that bordered on the glacial. He lifted a glass of amber lager, the liquid swirling gently against the rim as he brought it to his lips. He took a long, measured sip, the sound of his swallow audible against the distant crackle of the bonfire. Then, with the agonizing deliberation of a creature who had seen empires rise and fall, he blinked. It was a slow, heavy movement of the eyelids. He lowered the glass back to the table with a soft, final click. He did not speak. He simply returned his attention to the flames. The lingering awkwardness of the previous exchange dissolved as the party rhythm reasserted itself. Conversations surged back to life, and the clatter of plates resumed. Through the shifting bodies of the crowd, a new figure cut a path with effortless grace. Sanji moved with a dancer's precision, weaving between the seated guests without spilling a drop of the tray he balanced. He navigated past the boisterous laughter of the goblins and the intense focus of the eating contest, his eyes fixed on a specific point across the clearing. The air around him seemed to carry a sudden, sharp scent of seared spices and perfectly rendered fat, a stark contrast to the wood smoke of the bonfire. He reached the edge of the space where Xena sat, his pace slowing to a smooth, controlled glide. He stopped just within her reach, his posture impeccable, and his expression one of focused dedication. With a subtle, practiced flick of his wrist, he extended a single skewer toward her. The meat was charred to a deep, mahogany brown, glistening under the flickering orange light of the flames. He held it steady, the heat radiating from the skewer, waiting for her to acknowledge the offering. Xena did not reach for the skewer immediately. She leaned forward, her gaze shifting from the perfectly charred surface of the meat to the man offering it. She inhaled deeply, catching the complex notes of wood-fired spices and rendered fat that clung to the steam. Her fingers, calloused from years of gripping a sword hilt, brushed against the wooden handle of the skewer as she took it from his hand. She held the meat up, turning it slowly to inspect the evenness of the sear, noting the precision with which it had been prepared. The silence between them was not empty. It was a recognition of skill. She took a small, deliberate bite, the texture yielding perfectly to the heat. She chewed slowly, her expression sharpening into a look of genuine approval. She swallowed and looked back at Sanji, her eyes steady. She gave a single, firm nod, a gesture that bypassed polite conversation and went straight to the heart of the matter. It was the silent acknowledgement of one professional to another. Sanji bowed slightly, his task complete. As Xena turned her attention back to the fire, the skewer held with the same care she would reserve for a finely crafted weapon. A few yards away, the air felt heavy with a different kind of intensity. Goku and Vegeta sat cross-legged, the space between them rapidly becoming a graveyard of discarded skewers and bones. They did not speak. They did not look at one another. Their movements were a blur of efficiency, hands moving from the central serving platters to their mouths with the speed of a striking viper. A stack of empty wooden plates sat at Goku's left, already reaching his shoulder height, swaying precariously with every shift of his weight. Vegeta matched him, rib for rib, his jaw working with rhythmic, mechanical precision. He grabbed a handful of charred ribs, stripped the meat clean in one pass, and tossed the bones into a pile that rattled against the ground. The crowd nearby had stopped their own conversations, watching the duo with a mix of disbelief and caution. Every time a new platter of food was brought to the table, it vanished within seconds. Goku reached for a final, massive rack of ribs, his eyes locked on the horizon. Vegeta mirrored the reach, neither willing to yield the final piece. A few paces back from the frantic eating, Geralt leaned against a thick pine trunk. He watched the two combatants at the table, a faint, dry smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth as he observed the sheer absurdity of their hunger. He shifted his weight, crossing his arms over his chest, and let out a low, steady breath. The peace of his observation lasted only a moment. A sharp, rhythmic plucking of lute strings cut through the ambient roar of the party. Jaskier stepped into the firelight, his posture exaggerated, his fingers dancing across the instrument with practiced intensity. He cleared his throat, the sound carrying over the nearby chatter, and began to sing. Oh, the monster slayer, with a heart of gold, at a stag night, stories untold. The melody was bright, loud, and entirely unwelcome. Geralt stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the musician. He took a step forward, his hand coming up in a sharp, dismissive gesture. "Jaskier, not now," he grumbled. Jaskier ignored the warning, his grin widening as he struck a more dramatic chord, the music swelling. Geralt shook his head, turning his back on the performance. Away from the lute's persistent ringing, the atmosphere shifted toward a quieter corner of the clearing. Vesta stood near the flickering edge of the bonfire, her gaze sweeping across the assembly of guests. She watched a group of warriors sharing a drink with creatures that defied any standard classification. She turned her head, tracking the movement of beings who had crossed dimensions and lifetimes to stand in this one space. The contrast was sharp. The sheer variety of life forms, each with their own history of conflict or solitude, now occupied the same patch of grass without a single blade drawn in anger. She took a slow step toward Rimurus, who stood observing the flow of the party. Vesta leaned in, her voice steady and clear. "It is truly remarkable to see so many different beings gathered here in peace," she remarked, her eyes lingering on a pair of unlikely companions. She gestured toward the center of the clearing, where the disparate groups mingled with an ease that seemed to defy the natural order. Rimurus turned from the flickering orange embers, his expression softening as he met Vesta's gaze. He did not answer immediately, instead letting his eyes travel across the clearing, tracing the path of a dozen different conversations. He watched a group of warriors clinking glasses with creatures that had once been their sworn enemies. He took a slow, steady breath, the heat of the bonfire warming his face, and gestured toward the center of the gathering. "It is not just about the absence of conflict, Vesta," he said, his voice carrying a calm, measured weight. He smiled, a genuine, quiet expression that reflected the flickering light. "Look around. It is about the spirit of friendship. We are all here, from worlds apart, yet we are bound by the same choice to stand together." He swept his hand across the expanse. "These bonds are stronger than any history that came before." He leaned back, watching as the group continued to mingle. Rimurus gestured toward the edge of the fire, where two figures stood locked in a tense, focused standoff. Eren held a twig with a marshmallow suspended inches from the flames, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Zeke stood beside him, shaking his head with a look of clinical disapproval. "You are burning the exterior before the center has reached the necessary viscosity," Zeke insisted, reaching out to adjust the angle of Eren's stick. Eren pulled back, his jaw tight. "It is about the caramelization of the sugars, Zeke. If you move it too far from the heat, you lose the structural integrity of the crust." They hovered over the embers, their movements precise and calculated, as if the fate of the entire clearing rested on the perfect golden-brown finish of a single piece of candy. Armin stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, watching the exchange with wide, incredulous eyes. He looked from the charred marshmallow to the intense expressions on the brothers' faces, then back to the fire, shaking his head slowly. The absurdity of the debate seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. Away from the main circle of light, the forest floor sloped into a quiet patch of shadow. A massive, moss-covered log lay horizontally, serving as a makeshift bench. Batman sat on one end, his presence heavy and unyielding, staring into the dark tree line. Beside him, Joker lounged with his legs crossed, his movements fluid and restless. The chaotic roar of the celebration felt miles away, muffled by the dense canopy. Joker reached into a small wooden crate, pulled out a wedge of smoked cheese, and held it up to the firelight. He sliced a thin piece with a small blade, the scent of hickory smoke drifting between them. He offered a portion to the man beside him. Batman did not look at him, but his hand moved, with practiced precision, accepting the offering. They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the distant crackle of the bonfire and the rhythmic chewing of the dairy. Joker let out a low, genuine chuckle that lacked its usual sharp edge. "For all your brooding, you have refined taste in dairy," he remarked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Batman finally turned his head, the firelight catching the sharp lines of his face. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion of agreement. Joker leaned back, his eyes dancing with a manic flickering light as he watched the smoke curl upward from the log. He tapped his fingers against his knee, the rhythmic sound cutting through the distant music of the party. He looked over at his companion, his grin widening just enough to reveal the tension behind the expression. You know, for a man who spends his entire existence hunting shadows and chasing ghosts, you have surprisingly refined taste in dairy, he teased. Batman did not flinch. He remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight, his posture rigid as stone. He took another deliberate bite of the smoked cheese, chewing slowly, savoring the sharp, hickory-infused flavor before swallowing. The silence stretched between them, until Batman finally spoke. The pursuit of justice requires a well-rounded palate, he stated. He stared ahead, unblinking, fully committed to the act of snacking while maintaining the weight of his brooding, silent aura. A few yards away from the log, the atmosphere shifted. Wolverine sat hunched over, his back turned to the main bonfire. He ignored the laughter, the music, and the distant chatter of the heroes. His focus was entirely on a jagged piece of driftwood. He gripped the wood with his left hand, his knuckles white against the weathered surface. With his right hand, he extended his claws. The metal hissed as it bit into the grain of the wood. He began to draw the claws back and forth, a steady, rasping sound. He did not look up. He did not blink. Every stroke was measured, calculated to hone the edge to a razor-sharp point. He snorted, a sharp, dismissive sound, as a stray ember from the fire drifted too close to his boot. He shifted his weight, grinding his heel into the dirt to crush the spark, never breaking the rhythm of his work. He stopped, ran a thumb along the newly sharpened edge, and felt the bite of the steel. Satisfied, he resumed the motion. The mood near the edge of the clearing took a sharp, chaotic turn as Ted the Bear leaned forward, his fur matted and his expression conspiratorial. He gestured wildly with a half-empty mug, his voice raspy and booming, instantly drawing the attention of Gobta and Gabiru. He launched into a story that was as loud as it was crude, his hands tracing exaggerated shapes in the air. Gobta leaned in, his eyes wide and fixed on the bear, while Gabiru sat cross-legged, unable to hide his growing grin. Ted slammed his paw onto his knee, punctuating a particularly raunchy detail with a roar of laughter that echoed off the nearby trees. And then I told him, "You call that a thunder, buddy? I have seen bigger sparks from a wet match." The punchline hit like a physical force. Gobta erupted, throwing his head back and clutching his stomach, his laughter turning into a high-pitched wheeze. Gabiru followed suit, slapping his thigh and howling, until tears streamed down his face. The sheer volume of their reaction caused a few nearby partygoers to pause and glance over, but Ted only grinned wider. The echoes of the raucous laughter faded as Geld stepped away from the center of the clearing. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his boots crunching softly on the dry forest floor. Near the edge of the firelight, he spotted a small figure standing alone, watching the celebration from a distance. It was a little goblin girl, her eyes wide and fixed on the flickering flames. She shifted her weight, looking down at her hands, clearly hesitant to approach the main gathering. Geld stopped a few paces away. He reached into a woven pouch at his side and pulled out a warm, roasted potato. The steam rose in thin, curling ribbons into the cool night air. He knelt, his large frame casting a long shadow that reached toward her. He did not speak, but simply held the potato out, offering it with an open palm. The girl looked from the food to his face, her hesitation breaking as she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his rough skin as she took the offering. She clutched the potato to her chest, the heat radiating through her palms. Geld gave a slow, steady nod, his expression softening as he watched her take a small, tentative bite. Far from the warmth of the bonfire, the shadows pooled deep against the tree line. Sid Kaganu stood motionless in the gloom, his back pressed against the rough bark of an ancient pine. His gaze darted across the clearing, tracking the movements of every guest with clinical precision. To the casual observer, this was a celebration, But to Sid, the patterns were too deliberate. He watched the way the heroes and villains mingled, noting the precise timing of the laughter and the strategic placement of the food. He adjusted his eyewear, the lenses catching a stray flicker of light, and narrowed his eyes. This was not a party. It was a front. He observed the way the individuals moved, convinced he was witnessing the assembly of an elite, shadow-bound organization preparing for a global shift. Every toast was a coded signal, every conversation a tactical exchange. He shifted his weight, his boots making no sound on the forest floor, and scanned the perimeter for hidden watchers. The laughter of the crowd reached him as a distorted, rhythmic drone, confirming his suspicion that the entire event was a meticulously staged performance. Star-Lord stepped into the center of the clearing, his feet already tapping to an internal beat. He gestured toward Thor, who stood with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the festivities with a stoic gaze. Star-Lord began to move, his hips swiveling in a loose, practiced rhythm. He pointed at his own waist, urging Thor to follow suit. "It is all in the hips, Thor. You have to feel the rhythm. Let it flow through your core." Thor tilted his head, studying the motion as if it were a complex tactical maneuver. He uncrossed his arms and planted his feet firmly. He attempted to mimic the movement, but his hips remained locked, his knees stiff as iron pillars. He swayed from side to side. Thor tried again, throwing his weight with such force that he nearly lost his balance, catching himself with a heavy stomp. "This is not how we celebrate in Asgard, Quill. There is far too much hip and not enough thunder." The roar of the celebration began to lose its edge. The bonfire, once a towering wall of heat, settled into a steady, pulsing glow that cast shorter, more defined shadows across the clearing. Conversations that had been loud and overlapping started to thin out, replaced by the rhythmic crackle of burning logs. People moved with less urgency, their laughter softening into low murmurs. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the forest floor as the wind died down entirely. Even the most energetic guests began to find seats on logs or patches of grass, their movements becoming slower, more deliberate. The frantic pace of the evening had hit a wall. A strange, heavy stillness crept in from the tree line, pressing against the clearing, like a physical weight. The distant chatter of insects resumed, filling the gaps left by the fading human voices. Those still standing looked up, their faces illuminated by the dying embers, eyes fixed on the darkening canopy above. Nash sat on the edge of a weathered log, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. Beside him, Porco remained motionless, his gaze locked onto the shifting embers of the dying bonfire. The crackle of the wood provided the only rhythm to their silence. Nash leaned forward, the firelight catching the lines on his face. "I spent years looking over my shoulder," he said, his voice low and raspy. Every shadow felt like a debt coming due. Porco shifted, the wood groaning beneath his weight. He did not look away from the flames. "The badge does not make the past disappear," Porco replied, his tone steady but heavy. "It just changes who you have to answer to." Nash nodded, his jaw tightening as he stared into the heat. "It is not about what you have done, but what you choose to do next." The words hung in the cooling air. Porco finally turned his head, meeting Nash's eyes. There was no judgment in his expression, only a shared recognition of the burden they both carried. He reached out, resting a hand on the log between them. The conversation between Nash and Porco faded into the background, lost to the encroaching quiet of the forest. Nash stood up, his joints popping in the stillness, and stepped away from the log. Around the clearing, the other guests began to mirror this shift. The boisterous energy of the night had completely drained away, leaving a vacuum that felt heavy and expectant. Then, the air itself seemed to change. A sharp, cold draft swept through the trees, extinguishing the last of the smoke trails rising from the fire. It was not a breeze, but a sudden drop in pressure. Every person in the clearing stopped what they were doing. Goku and Vegeta froze mid-motion, their hands hovering over their plates. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was electric, vibrating with a tension that demanded attention. Every set of eyes in the clearing drifted upward. A ripple of movement passed through the crowd as they rose to their feet. Then, a single sharp gasp broke the stillness. Hundreds of people inhaled at once, their collective breath hitching in their throats as they stared into the black void above, waiting for the sky to break. The sky did not just brighten, it fractured. A single searing line of white-hot light tore through the zenith, followed instantly by a dozen more. The sound of the atmosphere igniting a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the soles of their boots. The forest floor, previously cast in the orange flicker of the bonfire, was suddenly washed in a cold, ethereal blue. Then came the reds and the violets, painting the canopy in colors that felt alien and impossible. Every person in the clearing stood paralyzed, their faces illuminated by the cascading streaks. The light was so intense it bleached the shadows from the trees, turning the dark woods into a landscape of sharp, high-contrast silhouettes. A second wave of meteors followed, denser than the first, turning the night into a frantic display of celestial motion. The air grew warm with the friction of falling debris. Above, the heavens were no longer a static void but a churning river of fire. The light reflected in the eyes of everyone present, turning the clearing into a mirror of the chaos above. The bonfire was forgotten, its flames rendered pale and insignificant against the brilliance descending from the stars. It was a deluge of light, relentless and overwhelming. The roar of the atmosphere faded, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt heavy. No one spoke, no one moved. The boisterous energy that had defined the night evaporated, replaced by a collective, breathless fixation. Goku and Vegeta stood motionless, their half-eaten ribs forgotten in their hands. Batman and Joker sat side by side on the log, their heads tilted back, eyes reflecting the cascading light. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. The crackle of the bonfire, usually a constant companion, became muted, as if the fire itself was intimidated by the display above. Every individual in the clearing was anchored to the spot. The sheer scale of the event stripped away all pretenses and rivalries. There was no room for debate, no space for banter. They were merely witnesses, small figures beneath an infinite burning expanse. The silence was absolute. Away from the main circle, V stood with hands buried deep in pockets, eyes tracing the arc of a dying star. Beside her, Johnny Silverhand leaned against a tree, his usual restless energy replaced by a heavy, uncharacteristic stillness. He watched the light wash over the forest, his jaw slackened, the constant hum of his internal agitation finally silenced by the sheer scale of the sky. V tilted her head back, her breath hitching as a brilliant violet trail split the darkness. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the horizon, where the fire seemed to touch the earth. Johnny shifted, his shoulder brushing hers, a rare, accidental point of contact that neither pulled away from. He let out a low, raspy breath, his gaze softening as he watched the celestial debris drift toward the tree line. "Beautiful," V whispered, the word barely audible against the faint crackle of the dying bonfire. Johnny did not offer a quip or a cynical remark. He simply nodded, his eyes reflecting the cascading blue light. For this brief, suspended moment, the chaos of their lives felt distant, eclipsed by the silent, relentless descent of the stars. The sky continued to bleed light, yet the heavy silence in the clearing began to fray. Rimurus shifted, the wooden chair creaking softly against the packed earth. He stood, his movement deliberate and slow, cutting through the collective trance that had held the guests captive for so long. As he rose, the firelight caught the edge of the glass in his hand, turning the liquid within into a flickering amber beacon. He did not rush. He let the silence linger for one final heartbeat, allowing the weight of the night to settle into the marrow of the gathering. One by one, the heads turned. Goku stopped his rhythmic breathing. Batman shifted his weight, his gaze finally pulling away from the heavens to lock onto the center of the camp. Rimuru planted his feet firmly, his posture radiating a calm authority that demanded focus. He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of warriors, outcasts, and legends alike. The meteor shower raged on behind him, painting the clouds in violent, beautiful streaks of violet and gold. But he was the anchor now. He lifted his glass, the motion smooth and steady. The air grew taut with anticipation. Every being in the clearing leaned in, the remnants of their awe shifting into a singular, focused attention on the man standing at the heart of the firelight. He was ready to speak. Rimuru cleared his throat, the sound sharp and clear against the dying crackle of the bonfire. He did not look at the sky anymore. He looked at the faces gathered around him, his expression softening into a genuine, quiet warmth. "To friendship," he began, his voice steady, resonant, carrying easily to the edges of the clearing. He paused, his gaze shifting to find Yggdrasil. The intensity of his focus drew the entire assembly with him, a collective turn of heads toward the woman who stood as the heart of his world. "To new beginnings that we build together, brick by brick, day by day." He took a breath, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass. "And to the most incredible woman I know, my waifu, Yggdrasil." He held her gaze, his smile deepening, a reflection of the firelight dancing in his eyes. "May our journey be as boundless as these stars, and may the path ahead be as bright as the light we share tonight." He gestured upward with his glass. The sincerity in his tone stripped away the last remnants of the night's earlier noise, leaving only the weight of his promise. He waited for the connection to land. The silence shattered. It began with a single shout from Veldora. Then a roar of approval surged from the clearing, shaking the very trees that rimmed the camp. It was a chaotic, thunderous chorus of voices, warriors, legends, and friends, all rising to meet the weight of Rimuru's promise. Above them, the sky responded. The meteor shower tore across the horizon in a violent, beautiful cascade of violet, gold, and searing white. The light flooded the clearing, washing out the orange glow of the bonfire and turning the faces of the crowd into masks of pure, unadulterated awe. Goku and Vegeta stood, their cheers lost in the sheer volume of the gathering. Batman remained still, but his eyes tracked the streaks of fire. Star-Lord clapped Thor on the shoulder, pointing upward, while Jaskier struck a final triumphant chord on his lute that rang out over the din. The air vibrated with the energy of 1,000 stories converging in one place. Rimuru lowered his glass, his smile widening as he watched the light reflect in the eyes of his companions. The night had become a living thing, a tapestry of shared history and future intent. As the last of the meteors streaked toward the earth, the cheers reached a crescendo. The fire crackled, the stars burned, and in the heart of the forest, the legend of the night was set in stone.